Military is often described as apolitical. But what happens when ideology quietly replaces constitutional accountability? Today, I'll be joined by Dr. Chase Spears to discuss DEI dissent and the growing tension between readiness and bureaucracy inside the U.S. Armed Forces. Welcome back to Finding Freedom here on the Lions of Liberty podcast network. Hope you've been enjoying the new intro music. It's been about a month. I've gotten some good feedback on it, so hopefully you guys like the bagpipes. I like them a lot. That's why I picked them. But before we get started with today's show, I want to talk about my favorite coffee. I have a cup of it right here in front of me. If you're watching on video, still have my Christmas mug. I don't put my Christmas mug away until the end of January. So drinking out of this mug, I have some Fox and Sons coffee. It's delicious. It's what I drink every single day. Keeps me going, keeps me sharp. And it's owned by a fellow liberty-loving guy, a freedom-loving guy, somebody who's an entrepreneur who started this company to teach his son about entrepreneurship. You can get your own Fox and Sons coffee by going to foxandsons.com. That's FOXNSONS.com, using promo code John at checkout for 15% off an order of $40 or more. Okay, let's get into today's show. And my guest today is Dr. Chase Spears. He's a 20-year U.S. Army combat veteran. He's a former public affairs officer who walked away from a major promotion to speak out about institutional capture inside the military. So today we'll be talking about DEI, constitutional accountability, and what it takes to show the courage inside a system that punishes dissent. Chase, welcome to Finding Freedom.
John, it's awesome to be with you today. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show and speaking out about this important topic. I think it kind of relates to a show I did a few weeks ago with Alvin Liu talking about the institutional capture and the wokeism and DEI that has crept in to the public school system via the school counselors. This is a different animal altogether, but there's definitely some parallels there. And we'll get into talking about all that. But before we go down that road, so my audience can get to know you a little bit better, if you can share a little more about your background, what brought you into the U.S. Army, why you chose that path, and just expand from there.
I'd be happy to. My career in the Army, I often tell people, is kind of the idea of a cosmic joke struck by God that went entirely way too far. If you would have known me and my family when I was younger, I have one brother, I have an older sister. No one in the family and no one who knew us guessed that I would be the one who would be a military guy. To this day, my brother actually still looks like a hardcore Marine. And funny enough, he did not go into the service, and I did. But what led me there was I always had a passion for news and journalism. I grew up listening to AM radio. I grew up watching cable news. This was back when cable news actually did a little bit of actual news, long time ago. And I really felt drawn to work in that industry. I felt like there's a place for Christians there to help inform people, help people to make wise decisions, help them know what's going on in government. And I had a particular affinity for investigative reporting. Anything investigative that I could watch, I did. But I went to a smaller school called Lee University, got a degree in journalism, and thought, okay, I'll go straight into the newsroom. And I graduated into an economy, which was kind of the Post-Telecommunication Act of 1996 economy, which means for your listeners and viewers, the news industry at that point in time was undergoing a mass consolidation. There was a buying frenzy of major media buyers buying up small market newspapers, television stations, radio stations, and with that meant there was a tremendous loss of jobs. CNN in Atlanta, which was our nearest major media market, laid off 400 people my junior year, if that gives you
Mm,
any indication. And so it was really tough to get started. There were lines of people out the door trying to get even unpaid internships. And so I thought, okay, well, let me go get a master's in journalism up the road at the University of Tennessee. That'll set me apart. That'll help. And what I found was the newsroom management, they appreciated someone going and getting graduate work in this, that they still were more focused on experience. They wanted people with several years of experience. Well, you don't have several years of experience when you're 22. And
right.
so I thought, what's the next thing that I'm passionate about? The Lord doesn't seem to be opening doors in journalism. I love law. University of Tennessee has a great law school. While I finish up my master's in journalism, I'll go work part-time at a law firm, scope that out, see what I think of it, and then probably work my way into a law firm. And as it so happened, working for that firm, the Lord directed my paths one day in the Knox County, Tennessee courthouse
Mm,
into Robert K. Lusk, staff sergeant type. He was a recruiter. This was 2003, the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and the Army needed people badly. And he saw in me a guy who was steady, who was married, who was college educated. We had a son at that point in time. And he saw me as someone who would be good to recruit. And he spent the next 7 months working on me and wearing me down. And we ended up enlisting in the Army to do public affairs work. And as a public affairs soldier, what was neat about it was that job is tailored to work with the news. You are working with reporters and helping to get information about the military and its activities out to the public. And I thought, man, what a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. It's still working close to news. I'll build up a portfolio. I'll do 4 years. I'll serve my country. And then I will get out and I will work my way into news. And as it so happened, the Lord just continued opening doors in the military for advancement. And 20 years later, I was like, wow, that 4 years went by really, really fast. But I decided it was time to get out at 20, which we can get into a little bit later as things were changing. And I felt like it was more important to be able to speak more openly than I would be able to if I'd maintained the uniform.
So 20 years were you working in public affairs that entire time?
Almost all of it.
Yeah. So that gave you a front row seat really to the institutional message and the cultural shifts within the military. So can you talk about like just kind of from a zoomed out view, how you saw that play out over time?
It was a seismic shift in the 2010 era. Keep in mind, I came in at the end of 2003. I retired at the end of 2023.
Okay.
The institution that I joined, all institutions inevitably have leftward drift. That's the nature of institutions. That's the nature of humanity. I mean, you can look at many denominations, you can look at many universities, you can look at the military. Any human institution, naturally, gravity inevitably pulls it away from its core purpose and towards a progressivizing or liberalizing purpose. And so the military,
Why do you think that is? What's your opinion on that?
I think it has to do with the sin nature of man.
Mhm.
Anytime that you get human beings together in a large collective and they're not driven primarily by just a total allegiance to scripture and a total desire to do what is right in the eyes of God, they inevitably drift away. I mean, we saw the first example of that is in Genesis, the Tower of Babel. You know,
Mhm.
men came together, they created a city, and they said, "We will ascend to the heights of where God is." And that arrogance is still very prevalent among us. This week, while we're recording, Davos is happening.
Right.
It's the same idea of these cosmopolitan secular elites getting together, thinking they're smarter and wiser than all, and thinking that they will direct the affairs of humanity. And so, anytime that you have an institution that allows just even the slightest deviation from what is morally true and right, that quickly spreads. It never remains just a 0.5% deviation. 0.5% very quickly becomes 3, 5, 10, and before long you're at 180 degrees. I'll give you case in point, Georgetown University, which is one of the schools that I hold a graduate degree from. And I had a wonderful time there. They treated me great. I learned a tremendous amount. I would argue that that was a life-changing experience for me in a very good way. But it is not a school that holds even to traditional Catholic teachings anymore. There are
Mm.
crucifixes in every classroom, but it is not a place that is friendly to the Christian message by any means. Why? over the years, they've moved from their purpose. Same thing with Harvard. It was started as a school to train ministers. So, anytime you get large groupings of men together and they begin to deviate, it quickly accelerates.
Yeah, that makes sense. That definitely makes sense. So I took you off topic there, but I'm glad we did that that little sidebar. So you can continue on. You were talking about that leftward drift that naturally happens, and I had asked you about kind of zooming out and looking at how you saw that play out over your 20 years.
Even the institution that I joined in 2003, it was not anywhere near what I left. What I got, the army that I got out of in October 2023 in no way looked like the army that I entered in 2003. And I mean,
Mm,
literally, no way. We'd switched uniforms multiple times, even. We didn't even dress the same way. But culturally, it was a very different beast. But even in 2003, it was clear that there were signs of social progressivism in the force, and that well predated even my lifetime because it's a human institution. But still, the institution that I joined, the Army in '03, recognize some basic truths. There are only two sexes, man and woman. The only naturally ordered sexual union between human beings is between a man and a woman. And even though the military has long been known as a place where of hookup culture, there was still culturally recognized a higher level of respect for married couples than soldiers who were just shacking up, you might say. It recognized that English was the language we were going to speak. This is something that we have in common. There were shared cultural assumptions. And even though the Army was, as we might say, a diverse organization, you could be in it and have differing viewpoints. You could be from anywhere in the nation and be in the Army. And that presented some challenges, but it was still recognized there are some basic ordered principles in line with creation truth in order with natural law that we recognize.
mhm,
2010 was when that all began to shift really, really quickly. And the reason for that is when President Obama got rid of the don't ask, don't tell policy. And that had been a policy that was started during the Clinton administration. And that was Bill Clinton's efforts to kind of soften the ban on homosexual service in the U.S. military, which goes all the way back to George Washington's days. And the reason for that is it's recognized that when you put human beings under arms
mhm,
on behalf of state, you want to know that they have a certain moral aptitude. You want them to recognize some basics of truth. You want them to respect some of the most basics of natural law. I'm going to go off topic here for a little bit. Why
sure.
is that? Why might that be important? We need to look even further back in history. Our founders did not like the idea of a standing army. Today, you're at the ball game, you're at the football game, you're at the baseball game, and there's always this moment where we had this salute the heroes and salute to freedom, and the jet flies over and the flag is unfurled, and sergeant or airman or whoever is chosen for the day to sit in the special seat gets the standing ovation, and we all cheer and beat our chest, yeah, sound of freedom, rah rah. That would have terrified our early ancestors, our early Americans. They knew that a standing army constitutes a danger to liberty for many, many reasons. And there's a whole lot of writing on this. You should see what Thomas Jefferson had to say about the idea of standing armies. It was understood that you raise an army when you need it for war, and you disband that thing to the maximum extent possible and keep a very small reserve force and militia based force. That's why the militia is mentioned in our Constitution, because they saw throughout history in Europe that when you have a standing army, it can get disconnected from the from truth, from its
Mhm,
purpose of defending the nation, of defending the people, and it can be very quickly co-opted by a strong executive to actually undermine freedom. So let's fast forward back to that's why is morality among military members important. That's why. If you're going to have a large standing force, you want them to have some kind of moral alignment to the people and principles of the nation. And in 2010, we saw that shift in a big, big way with Barack Obama wanting to completely get rid of the ban on homosexuality in the military. And the talking point was, hey, look, we just want everyone who wants to serve, who's patriotic, who loves their country to be able to serve. But in reality, what that was a Trojan horse, and it was
Mhm.
not even much of a Trojan horse. It was more like a flaming horse to come into the force and to completely shift the culture of the military and make it one that is not just open and accepting to people of differing worldviews, but one that is actually hostile to the traditional worldview that this nation is built upon.
I think that's the key in all this. When maybe not the key, but I think it's important to point out that when you talk about this DEI influence, this wokeism that creeping into public schools, creeping into the military, it's not like okay, um, we just want people to have equality. It's no, you have to do it this way, and thinking this way is only the right way. You thinking that way and putting God first, that's not right. You can't think that way. You have to think the way that we've dictated it, where there's multiple genders, many genders, not just two. So they put guardrails around the way that you have to think. And I'm curious in the military, obviously very disciplined. You have processes for everything. So, how was that framework, or was there a framework that was put in that changed the training and changed really how people are allowed to operate with regards to these things and forcing in the wokeism?
Well, it started when the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" ban was lifted, and I'll never forget. We have all sorts of trainings in the military. I mean, the military is a training organization; it trains
Hmm.
constantly, and we have all sorts of annual training requirements. Like I was supposed to qualify annually on a rifle. There were physical fitness tests to pass. Then there are a lot of web-based trainings that are probably comparable to what a lot of people who work in civilian organizations have to go through. But I'll never forget when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was dropped, I had never been trained by a two-star general. If I'd ever been trained by someone on any topic, it was usually a sergeant or maybe a captain. When I was a young lieutenant, before that ban was lifted, the Army had a big required suicide training, and that was done by a major, and that was because he was the company commander. But when this topic was changed, the military required that it had to be the generals coming and giving the training. Why the generals? Generals aren't the ones who go and train. They're the ones who manage and command large formations. It was because they wanted to make a very clear statement. This is driven from the top. You will get on board. Your argument is not with a sergeant or a captain or a lieutenant colonel giving the training. This is a general officer giving the training. So you
Hmm.
will listen. This is the way ahead. And I'll never forget the day that I sat in the room, the one and only time I received a training from a two-star general. And I sat in the room there at Joint Base Elmendorf, Alaska with, probably 200 other people. And this is one of many sessions he's having to give. And I remember getting to the end of the session and I actually raised my hand and asked, "Sir, are you telling me that if the family readiness group," and the family readiness group is an informal group of spouses, primarily wives, who get together and try to do things to help support the soldiers. And I said, "Are you telling me if the family readiness group, if there is a homosexual couple or a grouping of homosexual so-called couples coming in, that the married couples are required now by regulation to give them the same recognition and all the same benefits and all the same standing in the organization as if they were a legitimately married couple?" And he said, "Yes, that's what I'm telling you." And right then I knew now we're departing from reality. And now we're not only just telling the soldiers, we're telling the family members, this is the way. If you want to continue having institutional standing here, if
Hmm.
you still want to be formally involved, even you have to tell yourself that what I know not to be true is true. And so that was the very beginning of it. Very quickly thereafter, they also changed all of the military regulations. The military has an equal opportunity program. It's very similar to what a lot of large other corporations have. And they very quickly merged homosexual behavior into the equal opportunity program so that now they were not only allowed in, but they were a specially protected class. So that if I, as a commander or even as a soldier, voiced concerns or disapproval of disordered lifestyles, I could face charges because now I was in violation of the equal opportunity program. And it came very close to that actually in the towards the end of my career, and I can tell you a little bit about that later if we get there,
Mhm.
where I had a conversation with my boss and said, "I have significant religious concerns and objections to transgenderism as way of life, and therefore I cannot be actively involved in writing policy for the military that supports this and markets it as a net good for readiness. And so I just want to have a conversation with you about that before you give me that tasking." And even for that, he wrote me up. The only time I was ever written up as an officer for violating EEO program policies because I had expressed my religious conviction, and that was the tenor of where the military went was you're right. Even though there's a policy, it's a literal policy in the military that follows from the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. There's a policy that protects the religious right of conscience, but that policy has been blown asunder entirely by this radical progressing movement where military officers and senior leaders have instead said, hey, the political winds are blowing this way, and that's how we get promoted. And so we're going to honor the policies and the norms that we're being pushed culturally to honor disordered lifestyles, and we're going to completely disregard and throw away actual written policies, actual law, actual US code that protects the religious conscience of service members who know what the truth is.
So with all of this focus and all of these resources in the military shifting to all of these ideological DEI policies, naturally, there's resources shifting one way. You would think then they're shifting away from actually the purpose of the military, staying ready, long-term national defense. Did you see those competing priorities have a negative impact on the military's readiness?
Absolutely. Is this really came into focus when under the Obama administration later on, he pushed to open the doors to so-called transgendered service members, and I use so-called because there is no such thing. This is a
Mhm.
completely manufactured, constructed thing. The critical theorists talk about natural order and natural reality as a socially constructed thing, but it is they who actually socially construct things. We hold to what is true. But what I saw was, especially around the transgenderism issue, when you are a military member and you say, I want to change my gender, there are medical processes, there are hormonal processes that you have to go through, and that automatically takes you out of the fight. The military automatically would pull people with these so-called identities off of requirements for the physical fitness testing for a period of an extraordinarily long period after they had their so-called surgeries. The medicines, the chemicals needed for them to perpetuate these identities, well, these aren't things that you can just keep handy on a foreign battlefield. So automatically, by claiming these identities, you are automatically going to be pulled out of deployment readiness. What's the purpose of the military? The purpose of the military is to be able to deploy if necessary in order to defend the Constitution of the United States. And so, but these people were being not only brought in, but they were being encouraged. And so we were bringing in people who automatically, off the bat, were going to be non deployable. A second issue is the trust factor. And I'll never forget when I was doing my dissertation a couple of years ago, I did a lot of interviews on this topic. And I'll never forget one person I talked to told me a story about how this person is aligned with us in terms of what we believe to be true about men and women, but he was forced against his will to be the equal opportunity representative for a unit. And the
Mhm.
equal opportunity program has really become a radical thing in the military for social progressivism in the ranks. It's no longer about ensuring that everyone's rights are protected. It's about achieving social change. That's what it's become, and that's what it still is. And that needs to be completely abolished. And the Secretary of War has done a lot of good stuff to help take bites at that, but there's still a lot of work to do. But this particular service member I talked to, he was the equal opportunity representative for the unit. And he told me a story about how one day he was actually out of uniform. It was a weekend. He actually, out on a city street, ran into a colleague of his who was also an equal opportunity unit against his will in the unit. And they had both recently been forced to attend an advanced training in which there was a service member who was very clearly a man on stage, but this man was dressed in a dress and wearing
Wow.
heels and claiming that he was a woman. And this person I interviewed said the two of us saw each other in the street and we wanted to talk about it because we were just so blown away at the lie that was being pushed on us. But we were afraid even to have that conversation out of uniform, out in public on a weekend in case someone happened to walk by and hear us talking about it and then start looking for, oh, these must be military guys and they're not on board with this. How do we turn them
Mm,
in? And this is someone who is not a fearful person, but that policy was being pushed so hard. And so there's a trust factor. Automatically, people were walking on eggshells. Well, what can I say? Who can I say it around? And that's what I ran into during one of my last jobs when I approached my boss about this topic, asking if we could just have a discussion to keep me out of writing policy on behalf of it. And I had thought this was someone who would at least hear me out. We could have a respectful discussion on it and figure this out. But even he was so captured by the ideology and by wanting to please his superiors. Me just asking for that conversation was way over the pale culturally. And so you didn't know who you could trust. You didn't know who you could talk to.
mm.
And that's a massive, massive thing. When you begin to erode the ability of a service member to trust and have full confidence in the person to the right and the left, that has such a degrading effect on fighting readiness. And this is the exact reason that the military very deliberately never put this to a study. They didn't want to know.
It's crazy, like, when when you think about how this plays out in an organization like the military, and it's built, yeah, the military is built on trust. It's built on, obedience and taking orders, and when you don't have that trust, when you know the person who is your superior is lying to you, and they know they're lying, but they're doing it just in order to maintain their, their rank or their position, it's complete insanity. I'm curious, you know, as you were going through this, and you've talked about, you know, eh, not wanting to write procedures and trying to stop doing that, and being reprimanded. You at the end, you were offered a promotion that you turned down. Can you talk about that experience and any other, like, consequences that you faced for speaking out?
So I was a public affairs officer again, and that's someone who does a few things. One, we help to integrate the press with the military. We do what's called command information, which is internal communication. We supervise the people who run social media accounts. We supervise event photographers. We are the overall communication strategists, and at times we are the actual spokesman for the organization. And I have worked in all of those roles across my career.
Mhm.
And one of my last roles was as a training advisor, actually going around the army and helping train my peers, my colleagues, and some of my seniors on how to do this in a wartime environment because of my wartime experience doing it. And so in 2017, I mentioned earlier that Georgetown University had been a changing experience for my life, and that's for several reasons, but one of which is because I got very confident in writing columns and opinion editorials, commentaries on where things are. And so I began writing in 2017 and had some very quick success being published. And that got a lot of attention because it's not a cultural norm for military public affairs officers to write what they think. And I was very quickly at the hires, very quickly tried to push me into a corner and say things like, hey, when you signed on to be a PAO, you signed on to not have an opinion except that opinion that is given to you.
Mhm.
I checked my paperwork and I didn't see anywhere that I'd signed that away. And so I just continued doing it. I tried to be careful about it and tried to be smart, but I still felt like this is a talent that I have. These are things that need to be documented. These are things that need to be explored, conversations that we need to have. And so there was a consequence there. There was a lot of ostracization in the field. I very quickly heard people referring to me as problematic, as troublesome, as one who is is breaking the rules of what we're supposed to be doing. I'll never forget one time I was in South Korea. We had just finished up a training exercise where I'd been working with a captain during a battle simulation, and a really cool guy. We ended up having a great time together. And the last night of the exercise, we went out to dinner. He took me out just to kind of show me the local city and try to give me a little bit of feel for the culture off base. And he said, "You know what, Chase? You're way cooler than what I'd heard about you." And I said, "Well, what'd you hear about me?" And of course, it was the usual stuff, troublemaker, meddlesome, bothersome, blah, 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 all because I write. And so
Mhm.
I continued on in my career, and I decided this is who I am. This is what I'm going to do. I didn't seek trouble. I didn't seek to cause problems. But if being open and being respectfully truthful is going to cause problems, so be it. I got a lot of talking tos. I'll never forget getting pulled into the Pentagon one day, and there was an attempt made to intimidate me. And I told the senior officer who was trying to get me to shut up. I said, "Hey, sir, whatever you guys decide you want to throw at me, it's fine. I will take it like a man." I remember being told, "This isn't what you're supposed to do." And I said, "Well, I'm not violating any rules. I'm in full accordance with what I'm allowed to do." "Well, you shouldn't do that anyway." So there was a social price. But I continued on. I decided I feel like this is my professional responsibility. But the promotion came, funny enough, I got to the point, 2020 was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. My wife and I planned on doing a 30-year career. And once you get to 30 years, there's a lot of advantages financially beyond a 20-year career. And I was fully convinced that I was on the promotion track, that I would probably be able to make colonel on my trajectory, which is the ceiling for public affairs officers. And I was fully confident that, in spite of the fact that I was considered troublesome by some people, that my performance would still get me there because they weren't the ones making the decisions about whether or not I would be promoted. 2020 hit. And you know what happened to 2020. Your listeners know
Mhm.
what happened to 2020. And I'm looking around and I'm seeing the military in full blown disinformation, in full blown propaganda. And I'm watching them treat my colleagues who have sacrificed years of their lives, families who had sacrificed, people who have gone to war multiple times, been casually discarded, taken out like trash because they were asking simple questions. And I remember how I was treated by my boss for simply asking simple questions that, if the truth were on their side, they should have had no issue or no trouble or at all saying, "Well, yes, you bring up a good point and let me explain." If they would have explained, I would have been happy. They could never explain. They always just responded with anger, vengeance, and throwing people down at every opportunity. And at that point, I looked around and I thought, Christians are called to serve in every place and every time. Daniel had to serve in Babylon's in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Think he
Mhm.
chose that? No, but that's what the Lord had for him, and the Lord used it in a mighty way. And there are many, many other such instances throughout history. But I couldn't reconcile that I, as a Christian, was called to serve as the spokesman, the public apologist, the public defender of
Mhm.
an institution that was going so wayward. And so 2020, we made the call that we were going to go ahead and conclude at 20 years. And then 2021 and 2022 hit, and the transgenderism thing became even bigger. And we felt even more solidified in our decision. We're going to call this thing at 20 and move on with our lives. And we began making preparations for that. And then, as I was getting ready to retire, all of a sudden the promotion list for lieutenant colonel came out. And that is a rank that I had wanted since I first joined. I just thought, to be Colonel Spears, and it's a cool looking rank, and it comes with great responsibility. And it was something I'd looked forward to my whole career. And so, as I was in the process of retiring, the promotion list came out and I was on it. I was
Mm.
going to be promoted. The Army, in spite of all my critics, the selection board believed that I should be a lieutenant colonel. Now, I remember I was actually on a transition fellowship at that point in time, working in the state capitol over in Topeka. And I knew I was on the list several days earlier because a friend of mine on the inside had sent me the bootleg copy of it. But when it officially came out, my boss called me from Fort Leavenworth and said, "Hey, Chase, you do realize you're on the list?" I said, "Yes, sir. I realize I'm on the list. It's been made known to me. Are you sure you still want to follow through with retiring? Because that was turning away a sizable amount of money to retire as a major versus retiring as a lieutenant colonel. And I said, Sir, I appreciate the call and I appreciate your confidence in me, but the money isn't worth it at this point in time. Like we've made a choice to move on and we're going to continue with that choice. And a lot of people thought I was crazy. A lot of people still think I'm crazy. No doubt it would be nice to have a lieutenant colonel salary compared to what I make as a retired major, but we feel fully confident in what we've done. And I got to tell you, it was a shockingly easy decision to make. I'd always wondered if a very lucrative carrot were dangled in front of me, how would I react?
Mhm.
And I'm glad we reacted the way that we did. We have no regrets.
Yeah, well, I think as Christians, we're supposed to look a little crazy, right? Our decisions aren't supposed to make sense to the rest of the world. So I think you can definitely, take that with you and have confidence in that, obviously. So turning the page now and looking at how could this possibly be fixed within the military? What could the military do in order to, and maybe it can't be, totally reconciled, but from your perspective, what types of things would need to happen in order for the military to get back to how it was at the beginning of your career?
I tell you, if I had the perfect answer to that, I would be a lot happier man than I am. There are things that can be done. The first thing is to recognize it's not going to be an overnight fix. I've had so many people come up to me and say, "Oh, isn't it great now that P. Hegseth is Secretary of War and he's fixed everything in the military and President Trump's president, he did a couple executive orders and everything's fixed in the military." And I have to tell them, guys, gals, everything is not fixed in the military. Secretary Hegseth has done some really good things, and I give him tremendous credit. He has done a lot of good stuff to try to restore a sense of moral azimuth to the Department of War. But the military didn't get where it is in a day. It got there after years and years and years of progressive onslaught of planned activism in the force. It's not going to be turned around overnight. I mean, it's a big ship with a very small rudder. This thing needs miles and miles and miles and weeks to turn.
Mhm.
And the biggest thing that I argue is personnel is policy. I say again, personnel is policy. You can change the policy all day long, but until you get people willing to enforce the policy in the senior leadership ranks and even into the mid and lower tier leadership ranks, nothing's going to change. And our problem right now is the department remains infested with Biden, Obama holdovers, with people both civilian and uniformed who came up under that way of thinking, under that hardcore progressive left wing ideology, who grew up being trained if you want to get promoted, if you want to excel, if you want to be selected for these positions, this is the dogma that you hold to. And that's how they are conditioned. And many of them full on believe that. And a lot of them are hesitant. A lot of people who are in the middle who maybe they're not bought in with their hearts, but they're just kind of bought in with their heads. Well, they don't want to go against it now because then they risk being seen as being political, which is
Mhm.
ironic because it is actually political what they've done all these years. And that's a whole nother topic. The military is not a political spoiler alert, and everyone who's ever paid any attention for more than 5 minutes knows it. But the biggest thing is going to be clearing out people who are against the agenda. I'll give you a case in point right now. A year ago, President Trump signed an executive order saying that the military was going to restore all the people who were kicked out over COVID policy. They're going to be given full back pay and they're going to be made whole. A year later, that has not happened. A year later, I can't get
Wow.
firm numbers on how many military members the Department of War has reinstated because the Department of War doesn't even know. They're not tracking. The only firm numbers I can give you are from the Army. And as of last week, the Army had reinstated a grand total of 10.
Really?
10.
Wow.
That's how many the Army, and the Army is the biggest service. The Army is the biggest piece of the Department of War. So if they've only reinstated 10 with a team that's high octane and believes in this mission, Do you think the other services who are much, much smaller are going to have matched or surpassed those numbers? Probably not.
Mhm.
So right now, we just don't know the numbers. And why is that? The president gave an order. It's been a year now. The Secretary of Defense has given accompanying orders. Why is it taking this long? It's taking this long because of malicious compliance. The people who helped to bring in these draconian COVID policies, the people who were the ones kicking these service members, these brave patriots out, are the same ones being told now, oh, go undo what you did. There, who would be eager to undo what they did? They would
Mhm.
have to admit a moral culpability. They would have to admit they did something wrong. And there's no way they'll do that. A lot of them would rather die than admit they did something wrong, than admit they were on the wrong side of an issue. And so they are doing everything they can to hold it up. And God bless the guys on the Army reinstatement team. It's a team of 4 people, some of the best people you'll ever meet, some of the bravest, most high octane patriots you'll ever meet. But again, four people to try to remedy an issue that affects so many thousands across the force. And so personnel's policy, the Secretary of War and the president even has to get after executive authorities that will allow them to purge people en masse from these positions and replace them with people who will actually obey the lawful orders, unlike the unlawful orders of the previous regime.
Mhm.
But sadly, from my sense from talking to people inside the building is they're hesitant to do that because the question is, well, how do we replace them? You have these generals. It takes 20, 30 years to build a general. My response is it didn't always take that much time to build a general. We need to get focused on bringing people in these positions based on their ability to get stuff done, not based on their ability to navigate a bureaucracy for decades.
Yeah, I mean, the time t if you wanna really change things, then you have to throw out some of these old myths or, maybe they weren't myths at the time, but, it's not the same world today as it was, 20, 30 years ago. So I'm curious to get, what your advice would be to, current service members who currently maybe still are in a similar position as you were, fighting with maybe their career versus their faith or their conscience, and how they, some advice on how they could deal with that going through that struggle.
Well, they're going to have to realize this is a fight for the survival of the nation. And when you're in the military, what are you there for? You're there to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. You're there to protect America. And we have this idea that courage is only supposed to be a physical thing, but we lack moral courage. I wrote a piece last year about how military members need to get actively involved in the cultural fight to save the military as an institution. We have the Secretary of War who is saying plain truth. We have a president who's saying plain truth. Public affairs officers, commanders, JAGs, they need to begin saying plain truth. Now, I've reached out to people I know who are in the force and said, hey, look, Hexeth said this, and it's true, and it makes common sense. Every commander should be echoing this, but they're not. Every public affairs officer should be following that trend, but they're not because, again, they're afraid of, oh, well, if we say that, we'll be seen as political. Guess what? You are. You are political. The military is a political agency. It exists to achieve political ends. It is policy at the end of a gun. That's what it is. Read
Mhm.
Clausewitz, read any of the other military philosophers prior to 1950 or 60, even. This is a fight for the soul of the nation. So, military members who think like us need to start acting like us. And I'm not saying open activism in the ranks. Let me be very clear. I'm not talking about counter protests on base. What I'm talking about is standing firm in the truth, not being afraid to speak the truth, not being afraid to hold people accountable to truth. You have leadership that will give you top cover right now. And if you do something and you're at the company level and your battalion commander wants to punish you for it, go to your brigade commander, go to your division commander, and run that all the way up the chain because you have a Secretary of War who said, I will have your back if you're standing on truth. We need military members to look at themselves in the mirror, give themselves a good hard look in the mirror, especially Christian military members,
Mhm.
and ask themselves, when I'm 80 and looking in the mirror, what do I want to say that I did to help restore the institution and make it trustworthy while I was in it? Not nearly enough for asking that question right now. We need them to get in the fight for the heart and soul of the military. I'm outside the military. I'm 2 years removed. I mean, this is my problem because I'm a citizen still, but in a lot of ways, it's also not my problem. I'm fighting this. I sacrificed for this. You can too. Stop talking, start doing.
Well, that is excellent advice and maybe difficult advice for some people to hear, but I mean, I think people need to hear it. So, Chase, we're about out of time here, but I want you to let people know where they can follow you, where they can read your work, and where they can learn more about what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much for that opportunity. You can find me on most social channels at Dr. Chase Spears. I write for a variety of places: Red State, American Mind, Real Clear Defense. If you'd like to get alerts on when I've got a new article coming out, you can subscribe to my Substack. It's also at Dr. Chase Spears. And anytime I get a new article out, I'll post the link to it there. All of my written work is also featured at my website, chasespears.com. And I'd also like to encourage people, if you're looking for stories of courage on how to stand up, I've just made a bold charge to military members: stand up. I've got stories of people who have done just that on my podcast. It's called Finding Your Spine, and it's all about moral courage. And we bring in a lot of people. A lot of them are veterans. A lot of them are not veterans.
Mhm.
It's not an exclusively military show, but there are a lot of vets there. Some of them still actively serving that have stood up, and we tell their stories, and we use their life as an example to say, look, I know it's hard. It was hard for them too, and they still did it. This isn't just me, it's them too. You can do it. So I'd encourage people to check that out. It's the Finding Your Spine podcast, available anywhere you listen.
I like that podcast name, Finding Your Spine. That's awesome. So definitely check that out. Chase, thank you so much for coming on Finding Freedom.
John, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation and what you're doing here.
All right, thank you. All right, guys, that is a wrap for today's show with Dr. Chase Spears. Of course, if you like our content here at Lions of Liberty, if you like this show, which you get every Monday, and you like Lou Perez's show on Tuesday, and Brian McWilliams on Wednesday, and Brian Nichols on Thursday, and also politics every Friday, then be sure to subscribe, number one. But also, you probably want to become a supporter. You can go to Patreon or Locals, support us there, and get access to our bonus content. One of our bonus shows, Meme Wars, we'll be recording that later today. I'm saying that on Friday, January 23rd. So next week, when you hear this, it'll be out. You can join and hear that. With that being said, I'll be back next week with another great interview. In the meantime, always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.